Hi, welcome to Learning English with Pros. This is the channel where we draw on many years of university experience to provide you with reliable information on the English language and handy hints on how to improve your English. Hi, now you may be wondering why I want to take up the topic of lexical equivalence again, although it was already covered in the introductory course, so why deal with it again? Well, you can always look at things, and that applies to anything in life from various perspectives, and basically from a higher perspective and a lower perspective. And today we're going to look at the same thing, equivalence, but from a higher perspective than we did in the first video. So to use an analogy, we're sort of moving from classical mechanics to the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, if you like, if you want to compare that to the world of physics. So classical mechanics, as you may remember from your school days, divides the world into small objects, and these objects are governed by mechanical, the movement of these objects is governed by mechanical laws. And as you know, that's if you study physics, you'll soon find out that this is actually not true, and that the basic components of all objects and living beings don't behave like objects and can't be conceived of as objects. So while this doesn't make classical mechanics less useful at the macro level, where it can be used for all sorts of calculations, for instance, and at a level of understanding appropriate to school children, if you want to go deeper, you'll need to abandon all notions of objectivity, absolute motion, absolute time, and absolute space. And what we're going to talk about today is actually very similar, but of course this is about the realm of semantics. So in a way, when I talked about equivalence in the first video, I was addressing beginners in the translation trade. The advanced learner needs to understand that even with seemingly similar nouns like pessimismus and pessimism, there may not always be full equivalence between languages. So that translation choices can rarely be made at the word level. A partial exception being terminology, as we also saw in the introductory video. Cooking plant is kokerij. Culture-specific words, that's also something we learned in the first video, often constitute lexical gaps. So collegiate university needs to be rendered as Universität die aus mehreren colleges besteht, so you need to use a paraphrase here, or Jugendweihe, which I used in another video in an activity, needs to be paraphrased as something like, non-religious coming of age ceremony or something similar. So you should make a habit of critically interrogating any word-for-word equivalence, no matter how obvious it may seem. So phase is not always phase. That's the sort of higher perspective I want to instill in you in this video. What is perhaps a little bit reassuring is that equivalence can usually be achieved at the collocational level. So the longer the translational unit, the more likely it is for you to be able to establish a real equivalence. So we saw that, for instance, in the first video on lexical equivalence. Sophisticated scam can be raffinierter Betrug in German. So sophisticated is highly polysemous, but it's disambiguated. It usually has only one meaning once we consider a collocation. Or he recorded his impressions in his diary. Hielt seine Eindrücke in seinem Tagebuch fest. Record and impression is a collocation that can be rendered into German, although record on its own is highly polysemous. Schnell unter das Dach rennen, schnell rennen, of course, could be rendered literally as ran quickly, so a verb-adverb collocation. But of course, remember there were those descriptive verbs that I also talked about in the first video that can also be used in English. So we often have correspondences of this type. Verb-adverb collocation corresponds to just a verb in English. I dashed under the roof, which of course I ran quickly is certainly not wrong, but may not be appropriate to all contexts. Okay, so these are the kinds of things we're going to look at, and we're now going to explore a first example. So let me begin by showing you an example of what this talk is going to be about. This is a rather intriguing fragment from a self-help guide, which I've used in one of my translation classes. I'm particularly interested in the last sentence or two, which read as follows. People who are depressed have one dispiriting thought following another. When they look at the past, they feel regret. When they look at the future, they feel anxiety and pessimism. Now, as is often the case in translation, these sentences look deceptively simple and very easy to translate. But I hope you'll share my intuition that the collocation feel pessimism has no direct equivalent in German. You may just go ahead and translate this literally as Pessimismus plus fühlen, Pessimismus fühlen, without thinking about it. And that's the standard sort of situation a translator may be faced with. That's why I said earlier, you always need to interrogate critically what you're actually doing, and always interrogate critically those one-to-one equivalences. So what I'm going to try and do in this little presentation is to some extent explore why this is the case, why people usually just translate this literally, which wouldn't be appropriate here. So today's talk is in 4 parts following the standard IMRD structure: introduction, methods, results, discussion of research articles. In the first part, I'm going to talk about aims and scope. In the second, I'm going to explain the methodology that translators might follow. And then I'm going to present some results. And I'm going to discuss implications for translator behavior and also translation-related lexicography. So what I'm going to talk about today is partly based on a Franco-German research project that was called EMOLEX, a project that was funded jointly by the German Research Foundation and the Agence Nationale de la Recherche in France. As its name suggests, the project was about the vocabulary of emotion, and more specifically, we used the vocabulary of emotion as a test case for a new approach to lexicology, which combines more traditional structuralist methodology, what we call componential analysis in the first video on lexical equivalence. It combines that old type of methodology, which we might call the classical mechanics of linguistics, with more modern data-driven methodologies. So what I'm going to try and show today is how a combination of these methodologies can contribute to a more systematic description and explanation of intralingual and interlingual differences and similarities. And since I haven't got time to analyze the entire area of emotion words, of course, I'll be devoting most of my attention to just 2 words, disappointment and phase, and their German equivalents. Now, as I've been saying, the linguistic aim is to give a systematic description of intralingual and interlingual similarities and differences. Now, one particular interest of mine here is the identification of what I call collocational gaps. So we've already looked at lexical gaps, which are quite common in the area of culture-specific words like Jugendweihe and so on. Here I'm going to look mainly at collocational gaps. The second aim is translatological in nature. I'd like to systematize the use of translation procedures to render collocations and colligations adequately. We'll also look at error correction. How can you make sure, how can you even check whether something is an error in the first place? Okay. So that was the outline of my talk. I'd like to proceed with the methodology I've been using, which I've divided into 4 steps. Step 1 involves an analysis of the collocational and colligational profile of a word. One of the well-established methods in this area is Peter Blumenthal's profil combinatoire, which we might translate into English as combinatory profile, similar to the word sketches that we find in Sketch Engine. Now, the underlying assumption here is that both structuralist and contextualist semantics can make a contribution to describing meaning. Componential analysis is what we dealt with in the first video when we looked at a verb, descriptive verb, for instance, like skim. What does that mean? Smooth, fast movement over a surface without touching it, and so on. So we analyze the word into its meaning components, into its minimal meaning components, if you like. That's called componential analysis, and it was developed by structuralist semantics in the 1960s. We're going to combine that with contextualist semantics using the combinatory profile approach, or the word sketch approach, which I've just mentioned. So I think these 2 approaches are mutually illuminating, and this is because the identity of a word is determined both by the context in which it occurs, so the syntagmatic relations it contracts, the collocational relations, and by its content, so the paradigmatic relations, antonymy, meronymy, and so on. It contracts, and the distinctive features that distinguish it from other words. So, for instance, a simple illustration might be that words that are paradigmatically related frequently co-occur. For example, we often find antonyms co-occurring, such as rich and poor, or high and low. Now, the problem with both approaches, both kinds of meaning, is that they're ultimately circular. So if we describe, say, the difference between pretty and beautiful in terms of the presence or absence of a particular semantic feature, or several semantic features, such as plus, minus, aesthetically intense, aesthetic intensity, then the 2 words are only defined with reference to each other. There's no fixed point, no absolute, and in this way this really resembles the theory of relativity, and thus there's no independent basis for comparison. So in Latin, that's a case of what's often called tertium non datur. But the same circularity applies to contextualism, if you think about it. So contextualism attempts to define a word on the basis of the words that surround it, that are found in its environment. But the meaning of these words, in turn, depends on their environment, and so on. So there's infinite regression. What do we do about this? Well, we can turn to the work of the great Romance linguist Peter Blumenthal, who ingeniously came up with the idea of third-party entities that are involved in determining meaning, entities that have an impact on both the content of a word and its combinatorial properties. Or collocational properties. So a very simple example of this is the classification of our world according to temporal criteria. So the difference between live and settle can be explained in terms of the distinction between states and actions. Live is a state, settle is an action. So that may sound a little bit theoretical, and that's certainly enough on the theoretical background, I think. Let's look at how this works in practice. Okay. This is the example I've already shown you, and as I said, I'd like to focus on the translation of the collocation feel pessimism. Now, let's look at a little graph. So this is a slightly messy graph which shows the combinatory profile of English pessimism. On the horizontal axis, you can see typical collocates of pessimism. Among the top collocates, we get, for example, and, optimism, and deep. The vertical axis shows the significance of these collocations in terms of a statistical measure known as log likelihood, for those who are interested in that sort of thing. So log likelihood is not just a measure of mere frequency, it's an indicator of how probable it is that an event has occurred by chance. So if the cutoff point for log likelihood is set at 6.63, for example, this means that the probability of two words co-occurring by chance is less than 1%. So log likelihood can be thought of as the quantitative equivalent of what Hausmann has called the affinity between words, the partnership, the force with which they attract each other, we might say. So what about the affinities of pessimism? Well, the first thing to note here is that it collocates significantly, most significantly, with and other nouns. So nouns like optimism, fear, despair, and anger. So it's often associated with feelings in English, apparently. So a second thing to note perhaps is the dense use of adjectives that describe intensity of feelings. So we have deep pessimism, excessive pessimism, pessimism grows, much pessimism, profound pessimism. So this is all about intensity. And final thing to note perhaps is the use of this and such. So retrospective labels that sum up the previous context in a nutshell, if you like. And these often occur in front of pessimism. If we now compare this to German Pessimismus, we find that there are a number of collocates that the German noun shares with its English counterpart, such as Optimismus and übertrieben, but these are less significant than in English. We also find significant differences. So German Pessimismus often occurs with Grund und Anlass for Pessimismus, and there's no real English equivalent. Sometimes, of course, a verb like engender is used, but that's quite rare compared to the very frequent use of Grund, Anlass with Pessimismus in German. Then, interestingly, the verb warnen is used in front of or in collocation with Pessimismus. What does this show us? What is it indicative of? Well, it shows that the noun pessimism in German is it's an attitude rather than a feeling. Because if you warn people of something, you don't warn people of a feeling. You don't say, I need to warn you of your anger. That's impossible. You can only warn people of a wrong attitude, or of course of an event that's going to happen. But this clearly shows that there's a difference in ontological spheres, you might say, between the German and the English noun. This is confirmed by the third collocation, which I'd like to highlight here, and that's nähren. What you normally nähren? What does nähren collocate with in German? Well, Hoffnung, Zweifel, Spekulation, Gerücht. So things that are beliefs or opinions. To summarize this, and perhaps also we can get some additional information from Wikipedia here. Wikipedia 2014 defined Pessimism as die Lebensauffassung von der unverbesserlich schlechten Welt. In 2019 it says, ist eine Lebensauffassung mit einer Grundhaltung ohne positive Erwartungen. It's still a Lebensauffassung, it's still an attitude. Whereas in 2014, at least, it was defined as a state of mind. So that's much closer to feeling in the English language Wikipedia. So we can see the difference here on the basis of combinatory profiling, we arrive at the conclusion that German pessimism is an attitude, English pessimism is also an attitude, but may also be viewed as a feeling. What does this mean for our translation? It means we have to resort to some sort of reformulation which takes account of typical collocational and colligational features of the German word. So this is what we might write. Certainly not Sie fühlen Angst, Sorgen und Pessimismus, but rather der Vergangenheit trauen Sie nach, in die Zukunft schauen Sie voller Sorge or mit Sorge und Pessimismus, because this particular structure can be used both with attitudes and feelings, or you can make a shift here and use sorgenvoll and pessimistisch. So transition from a noun to an adjective. That was an example of using the combinatory profile to establish basic differences in meaning and in ontological spheres between words in German and words in English. We're now going to apply this to emotion words. And the second step, before we go on to step 2, I should mention that, of course, you can also do that on your own by using, for instance, the collocations function in Sketch Engine, or the word sketch function in Sketch Engine, which will give you something that's very similar, computer-generated summary of a word's typical environment. In step 2, you categorize collocates by semantic criteria. That's what we're going to look at now. So if you do a detailed analysis of emotion nouns using semantic criteria, or rather using the combinatory profile or word sketches or collocations analysis, it's easy to observe that many emotion nouns typically combine with verbs that express the ways in which humans exercise control over their emotions. So you will typically say things like to calm an emotion, to conquer an emotion, to dispel an emotion, to ease an emotion, to alleviate an emotion, to overcome an emotion. So that's to do, all of these verbs are to do with control, emotion control. And this then leads one to posit a semantic dimension that we've termed emotion control here. So if you carry out a detailed analysis of emotion words, or any other type of word for that matter, you'll arrive at different types of classification. For emotion words, we've arrived at this 8-way classification, which can be seen in this slide. I think it's more or less self-explanatory. I'm not going to go into any further detail here. Well, just a few words perhaps about the main categories. So manifestation means or refers to the physical signs of particular emotions. So an emotion, for instance, was etched on his face. That's a manifestation of an emotion. We've already talked about control. So conquering your fear, for instance, is controlling your fear. So that's emotion control. Intensity, we've already seen that with English pessimism, for instance, deep pessimism. Although that's more of an attitude, it might be described in terms of intensity. So how strong is an emotion? Causativity is about causative verbs. Something causes an emotion. Verbalization is cry in astonishment, for instance. So you add a descriptive element to how is it verbalized? Descriptive element to the noun, for instance, cry in astonishment. Astonishment is verbalized by means of crying in that particular case. Polarity, that's an evaluative dimension. So is it good or bad? Is it positive or negative? Aspect, that's the temporal flow of an event. You may have heard about this. It also occurs in the distinction between progressive and simple forms. So, for instance, does an emotion begin at a particular point? Does it go on? Does it end? And so on. And the mode of experience, and how do you experience the emotion. Each of these can take on particular values. I'll just illustrate this very briefly using causativity here. So neutral causativity would be basically cause or produce a surprise, a source of surprise. If it's the phasal inchoative aspect, then it could be, for instance, eine Überraschung auslösen in German. Or if it's phasal in plus high intensity, then it's compound someone's disappointment or fuel someone's disenchantment. Or if it's low intensity plus phasal, it's easing someone's fears. Or if it's terminative, then of course it's about overcoming fears. These are just a few examples, of course. You could cite hundreds of collocations here. So once you've categorized collocates by these semantic criteria, the next step involves calculating the relative weight and importance of particular semantic categories in the languages you're dealing with, based on log likelihood again, so that you can then create contrastive combinatory profiles, contrastive word sketches. This can be done almost automatically in the sketch engine. I'm going to explain that in another video. In step 4 then, we establish equivalences and describe the underlying translation procedures. So you can compare the collocates of equivalent nodes with a view to ferreting out collocational gaps, for instance, Liebe and love, Stolz and pride, Enttäuschung and disappointment. This is what we're going to look at now. What are the implications, first of all, for lexicography and lexicology? Well, one general outcome of this type of research is, of course, an enormous gain in precision when it comes to finding collocational equivalents and collocational synonyms. So we have equivalence here on the horizontal axis, synonymy on the vertical axis, and you can easily identify synonyms like überwinden, verarbeiten, verkraften, which can all be used with Enttäuschung in German, Enttäuschung, überwinden, verarbeiten, verkraften, and English synonyms that are at the same time equivalent to these German collocations: get over, overcome, recover from, bounce back from a disappointment. So you can sort of semi-automatize the search for synonyms and equivalents. You have perfect reliability that doesn't require any lateral thinking, and it shows that this onomasiological approach, so starting from the meaning, not starting from the individual word as you would in a semasiological approach, this has obvious advantages. As you may remember from the previous slide, Enttäuschung plus wegstecken, and Enttäuschung wegstecken can be translated into English as shrug off disappointment or put a disappointment behind one. If you look at Lingui, you don't find any of these translations, probably because translators couldn't think of them because they didn't carry out such a combinatory analysis. So we can see that this is superior to using dictionaries, using Lingui, parallel corpora, and so on, because previous translators simply may not have gone to such lengths, you might say. Now, this is a general comparison between German Enttäuschung and English disappointment, and it shows you the relative weight taken up by each of the semantic categories for these nouns. We arrive at these figures by adding up the log likelihood values for each of the dimensions that we've just looked at. This is in French, but you recognize the dimensions, manifestations, manifestation polarity, and so on. These are the same terms in French and English. So do these differences in weighting and relative weighting reveal important interlingual contrasts? Well, yes. If you look at, for instance, manifestation, then that's clearly more prevalent in German than in English. What's also obvious is that verbalization is more common in English. What does this mean in practical terms? Let's look at a few examples. So relative weighting of semantic categories again. With Enttäuschung, so both nouns have intensity in first position here, but as soon as we get to second position, we have polarity in German, but verbalization in English, so there's a difference. Then we have aspect in German, polarity in English, and importantly, manifestation in German in fourth place, in English, aspect in fourth place. And the definitions, if you look at good dictionary definitions of the two words, they also differ. So in German, Enttäuschung is Nichterfüllung einer Hoffnung oder Erwartung, die jemanden unzufrieden stimmt. Das Enttäuschtsein. That's taken from the Duden, große Wörterbuch der deutschen Sprache. So the emphasis here is on polarity, you might say, Nichterfüllung einer Hoffnung, die jemand unzufrieden macht. Which sort of confirms the second position of polarity here. In English, disappointment is defined as sadness because something has not happened or been as good, successful as you expected or hoped, or it's a person or thing that is disappointing. So there's a second meaning here, a person or thing that is disappointing, that is not mentioned in the German definition. Let's see whether that is justified by any of the evidence we have. Well, there are differences in relative weighting, and we'll now see what these are due to. So, for instance, we find die Enttäuschung beim Anzusehen, anzumerken in German quite a lot. So that's why manifestation is so important. But although you could theoretically say you could see the disappointment on his face or in his eyes, or disappointment was etched on someone's face, that's pretty rare in English. Whereas we do have disappointment in someone's voice quite significantly in English, but here German has no real correspondence. Enttäuschung der Stimme is pretty rare. So we can see that these things play out differently in the two languages. Tränen der Enttäuschung vergießen, another manifestation. Shedding tears of disappointment is again a rare occurrence in English, perhaps due to the famous stiff upper lip. Vor Enttäuschung weinen, to cry or weep with or in disappointment. Again, there's a huge difference in frequency and significance here. Verbalization, well, that's quite common in English, as we've seen. So and that's mainly due to the expressions express one's disappointment, voice one's disappointment, speak of one's disappointment. Whereas in German, Enttäuschung äußern or kundtun is actually quite rare, or zum Ausdruck bringen and so on. So we need to use a transposition here, a class shift, and say something like sich enttäuscht zeigen or sich enttäuscht äußern. And this is more of a manifestation then again. So we can see how English verbalization gets converted into German manifestation here. Another striking difference between English and German is in the relative weighting of the punctual iterative aspect. So something gets repeated. This is basically the second dictionary sense that we've already noted. So disappointment as an event, which is far more prevalent in English compared to German. So and we can also see that from collocational gaps such as sad disappointment, but mainly from occurrences such as many disappointments, myriad disappointments, various disappointments, repeated disappointments. None of these are terribly frequent in German if you translate them literally. So what do these results, now we've looked at you might say, the outside of these words, the outside environment that surrounds these words, what does that tell us about the inside of these words, their content? To take another example here, to start with another example which I investigated in another study, Überraschung, for instance. If you look at the combinatory profile of Überraschung, what you find is that Überraschung is an event that belongs to the outer world, but surprise in English is a feeling that belongs to the inner world, and Blumenthal confirms that for or has similar findings for French. Enttäuschung, the word we've just looked at, seems to be a feeling mainly. Also, more rarely in German, a person and an event. It does have that secondary sense, that second meaning, although that's not mentioned in the Duden. But disappointment regularly has this second sense, and as we've seen, it's far more prevalent in English than in German. So disappointment is a feeling plus a person or an event. A person can be disappointment, an event very frequently is. So we can identify potential collocational gaps, or we can now predict with some degree of certainty where we'll need a transposition. For instance, if you express disappointment or surprise or amazement or bewilderment or astonishment or horror or satisfaction, in German that needs to be sich überrascht, verblüfft, zufrieden, zeigen or äußern, and so on. So in German that needs to be a manifestation. In English it's what we call a verbalization. And there are also cultural differences, of course, that we've noticed. Standard thought patterns or cliches. So for instance, in German we often say die erste Enttäuschung war schnell verflogen. This is more or less untranslatable into English. At least there's no standard collocation to render it, but there's several different renderings, like to fade, to wear off, and so on. I said earlier that I also wanted to look at collocational gaps between English and German, and here are some of those. So in German, for instance, we often, spüren Enttäuschung mit Bier oder Wein herunter. That's apparently typical of Germans. Although you can theoretically render this into English by using drown one's disappointment with something. It's not very frequent, certainly not with wine or beer. You do occasionally find it with rum, for instance, but it's actually quite rare. And of course, jemand von Enttäuschung bewahren, that's also very frequent in German. You can literally translate that by means of spare someone a disappointment, but it's quite rare in English. I already mentioned die erste Enttäuschung war schnell verflogen. The initial disappointment quickly faded or disappeared or wore off, and so on. But again, these are very rare in English, so there's a significant difference in frequency. Also, we often use Enttäuschung plus entladen, entlädt sich auf jemanden, oder eine Enttäuschung auf jemanden laden. This could be translated by several different renderings, but there's no standard equivalent in English to vent one's disappointment, take out one's disappointment, bear the brunt of disappointment, and so on. There's also the phrase, the phrasing, we might say, der Stachel der Enttäuschung saß tief. Untranslatable, there's no similar metaphor in English. Pain of disappointment is the closest English gets to it. And then we have a few English collocations that are significantly frequent, like a disappointment looms, which could be translated as kündigt sich an, but that's not common in German. It's just not used. Perennial, perpetual disappointment, dauerhafte Enttäuschung. That's I'd say even of doubtful acceptability in German. I personally wouldn't use it. Or a season of disappointment in sports. Well, enttäuschen is a Saison, of course. We could use a transposition here by means of an adjective. Then we have a pang of disappointment. Difficult to translate because pang or twinge are brief, piercing spasms of pain. And we only have a very simple word here to render this in German, or Menschmerz, Enttäuschung, which certainly is not as graphic as the English word. Wallow in disappointment, verharren, schwelgen. You don't do that with Enttäuschung normally in German. And sad disappointment is not traurige Enttäuschung, perhaps a schmerzliche or herbe or arge Enttäuschung. Another interesting collocation is avenge one's disappointment, which is normally used in sports. And this can't be translated using disappointment at all. You have to use a transposition again and say something like eine Niederlage wettmachen, eine Niederlage ausmerzen. So it's about defeats in sport. And doomed to disappointment, that's another one that's almost untranslatable. So we've got some evidence, at least, of collocational gaps here. If you do a bit of number crunching here, you'll find that actually I may have overstated my case a little bit in a way, because with disappointment, for instance, only 5% of all occurrences lead to collocational gaps. So you might say, I don't need to worry too much about them. What it means really in practical terms is that in 1 out of 20 cases in which you encounter disappointment, you may have to opt for a different translation. You can't translate a collocation by a collocation. So it is actually quite significant, 1 out of 20 cases. With love and Liebe, that's very similar. With Stolz and Pride, luckily, you can always translate pride or Stolz by means of pride, not the other way around, by the way. So if you boost your pride, for instance, that's ein Selbstbewusstsein steigern. So you can see, of course, that can be translated. It's not a collocational gap, but pride has several shades of meaning that are not present in German Stolz. So what's the relationship between collocational gaps and translation procedures? Well, it seems that modulation is used in cases where there's a collocational gap. So, for instance, avenge one's disappointment in a sports context is eine Niederlage wettmachen, as we've already seen. You need to use modulation here, so change in perspective. In this case, substituting a different word for disappointment, substituting Niederlage for disappointment. Or you could use a complex transposition, sich für seine enttäuschende Leistung revanchieren, where disappointment is turned into an adjective, enttäuschend in German. Same thing with spread love. You can't do that in German, so it needs to be a slightly different metaphor that comes close to the English, Liebe schenken, for instance. Transposition is used in cases where there's a difference in frequency between the source language and the target language, or where there's polysemy of the source language syntagm. So brotherly love, for instance, could theoretically be translated as brüderliche Liebe, but since Bruderliebe is more frequent, we need a transposition here. Here I'd like to take issue with how the translation process is often described in the literature on translation or in translation textbooks. And I'll cite a typical example here. Sind eventuelle Unklarheiten geklärt, so gelangt der erfahrene Übersetzer durch interlinguale Primärassoziation schnell zu dem englischen Substantiv anger als Übersetzung des deutschen Begriffs Wut. Um jedoch sicherzugehen, dass die beiden übereinstimmen, bietet es sich an, die Definition in einsprachigen Qualitätswörterbüchern zu vergleichen. Nach Überprüfung der Annahme, dass anger in der konkreten Übersetzungssituation die bestmögliche Wahl auf der paradigmatischen Ebene ist, muss der Übersetzer nun eine Wahl auf der syntagmatischen Ebene treffen. Dieser Selektionsprozess erweist sich jedoch als weitaus komplexer als der erste. Now this is actually problematic because it overlooks the close interdependence between the paradigmatic and the syntagmatic. As I've been showing throughout this talk, the paradigmatic is the syntagmatic in another guise, if you like, and many errors arise from such primary interlingual associations. So what you should really do is in a first phase, if you like, a first step, is do a syntagmatic analysis of several potential equivalents, as we've seen, so collocation and profiling of several potential equivalents, a word sketch, for instance. And then ask yourself, in a second phase, what does this analysis reveal about the meaning of potential equivalents, and which is the closest equivalent? And if there's no direct equivalent, you need to search for equivalents at the phrase level or redistribute information units and so on. In the third phase, you would then choose the best possible collocations and collocations. Let's look at a worked example where things have gone wrong. The way Europe currently deals with languages as foreign languages is crucially determined by the phase of the nationalization of languages, taken from Carl Friedrich Knapp, Handbook of Foreign Language Communication and Learning, and probably translated, or it has been translated from German. So let's look at phase. Is that correct? So talking about the phase of the nationalization of languages. Well, what you can do again is a word sketch. What's quite apparent, for instance, if you look at the adjectival modifiers of phase, is that phase often collocates with first, second, next, and so on. So it seems to indicate a clear order. If you compare that with period, then we have nouns like spend a period, cover a period, verb collocations, spend a period, extend a period, require a period, specify, agree, the intervening period, die Zwischenzeit, and so on. And what we don't find is first, second, third, and so on. If we now look at the differences between phase and period, make a comparison, phase appears in green here. We can see that, again, first and second and so on are primarily used with period, whereas prolonged, lengthy, medieval, historical period, for instance, that's usually, or even predominantly, almost exclusively used with period. So if we do a painstaking analysis like that, then these collocation of profiles that we establish reveal subtle differences in meaning, which you do not find in dictionary definitions. That's why you have to do this kind of work yourself. So phase, if we want to define phase in a way that's more appropriate than the dictionaries do, we could say it's a linked sequence of different stages and usually describes the parts of a whole. So phase is usually a part of a whole. So we have the planning phase, the implementation phase, or the first, second, third phase. Whereas a period is a time of indefinite length in which something is completed, seen as a unified whole, and there's no relation to other lengths of time. So you spend periods, you don't spend phases, and that's apparent from the word sketches. You can say during the intervening period, indefinite length, no relation to other periods, but you can't say phase during the intervening phase. You can say it's history, historical period, spanning the period from the Iron Age through to the 5th century, but you can't say spanning the phase. And the same thing with historical period, historical phase is non-existent or almost non-existent. If you look at the colligations, that is the typical grammatical company these words keep, and you compare German Phase, the phrase, of course, that was translated here must have been die Phase der Nationalisierung der Sprachen. So Phase in German is often followed by a genitive and then perhaps another genitive. In German, we can use Phase in this particular sense, where we see it as a unified whole and not one of several successive phases. In English, phase is usually one of several successive phases, as some of the examples on the left clearly show, been made available in the first phase of the renewed expansion. You can also use an of phrase here, but it's usually combined with a new phase, a first phase, a particular phase, and so on. Period can be used with of, but that's pretty rare. So in this particular academic corpus I've used, you get 60 hits that show period occurring with an of genitive, imitating the German structure closely, if you like. What's far more frequent is period used with when, 290 hits, the period when. So this is a more natural structure in English. Use period with when and a verb to render the German genitive construction. And this gives us so period or phase when something happens in German, Phase plus genitive. So basically we've seen that there are two major differences between German Phase and English phase. One is colligational, grammatical, and the other is collocational. So we need to rephrase this sentence as follows. Current European attitudes to foreign languages can be traced back to the period when national standard forms of European languages began to be promoted, or perhaps a little less clearly, when languages were being nationalized, because the verb nationalize, of course, normally occurs in the context of privatization versus nationalization, the nationalization of industries, going public versus going private, in other words. To summarize what we've achieved, what we've learned today, one thing we've learned is that combinatorial profiling, syntagmatic analysis, word sketching, you might say, takes precedence over paradigmatic considerations, is something an antonym of something else, and so on. So meaning can be described with almost mathematical precision by a combination of combinatorial profiling with semantic profiling. This helps us to operationalize the practice of translation on the basis of objectively verifiable procedures and concepts. So we can determine relations of equivalence and synonymy precisely, and we achieve some degree of predictability of particular translation procedures. So for instance, a collocational gap will usually result in modulation or a complex type of transposition. So what I hope this video has shown is that there's still an important role for the translator's basic stock in trade, and this is something that the human translator can still do much better than any machine translation tool such as DeepL. If the human translator, that's a big if of course, has excellent lexical, grammatical and text making skills in at least 2 languages, and the ability to conduct the sort of linguistic analysis which we've just been doing. Also, you need a thorough grounding in contrastive linguistics and in semantics. As we've seen, basically what we've been doing today is a combination of componential analysis, which dates back to the days of structural linguistics, and more modern corpus-driven analysis, doing word sketches, producing computer-generated summaries of a word's environment. Thank you for watching. See you next time.